The last patient to leave the Pembroke Mountain Sanitarium walked out on her own 2 feet, but she never made it home. Eudora Pembroke watched from her office window as the woman disappeared into the Virginia fog, knowing she'd be found 3 days later at the bottom of Raven's Gorge with her tongue cut out. This wasn't just another tragic accident in the remote Appalachian Mountains. It was the final piece of evidence that would expose one of America's most horrifying medical conspiracies. Before we descend into the mountain shadows where this horror unfolded, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. If this story grips you the way it should, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened in those mountains will change how you think about trust forever. High in the remote hollows of western Virginia, where morning mist clung to ancient ridgelines like burial shrouds, the Pembroke family had built something they called a health retreat. The facility promised miraculous cures for consumption, nervous disorders, and the mysterious ailments that plagued wealthy families from Richmond to Charleston. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of wood smoke and medicinal herbs, while pine needles crunched beneath the feet of arriving patients who believed they'd found salvation. The imposing 3-story building rose from the mountainside like a white monument to progress, its wraparound porches and stained glass windows suggesting refinement rather than the charnel house it would become. Eudora Pembroke, the facility's founder and head physician, had studied at prestigious medical colleges in Philadelphia and Boston. Her credentials were impeccable, her manner reassuring, and her methods revolutionary. At least, that's what the carefully crafted advertisements claimed. Dr. Archibald Briarwood arrived as the facility's consulting physician in October of 1895, drawn by Eudora's reputation for treating cases other doctors had given up on. The mountain roads were treacherous that autumn, carved into cliff sides that dropped into darkness, but the promise of witnessing groundbreaking medical techniques made the journey worthwhile. What he discovered in those first weeks seemed to justify every word of praise he'd heard. Patients who arrived gaunt and hollow-eyed began to gain weight and color. Women suffering from nervous exhaustion reported renewed energy. Men battling mysterious wasting diseases showed remarkable improvement. But Dr. Briarwood was a meticulous observer, trained to notice what others missed. The patients improved, yes, but they also changed in ways that defied medical explanation. Their personalities shifted, their memories became unreliable, and most disturbing of all, they developed an almost religious devotion to Eudora Pembroke that bordered on worship. Hospital records from 1896 reveal a troubling pattern. Of the 87 patients admitted that year, only 34 were discharged alive. The official cause of death was usually listed as complications from underlying conditions or sudden cardiac failure. But Dr. Presenter, Briarwood's private notes, discovered decades later in a trunk beneath his family's farmhouse, tell a different story entirely. October 15th, 1896. Patient exhibits signs of deliberate poisoning. Pupils dilated, skin pallor inconsistent with reported symptoms. EP dismisses concerns, claims improvement is normal process. The terrible efficiency never stopped. Every month brought new patients, drawn by testimonials from grateful families who praised the Pembroke facility's miraculous results. What they didn't know was that these testimonials came from relatives who had never seen their loved ones again, relatives who had been told their family members had recovered so completely they'd chosen to start new lives. Elsewhere, the mountain isolation that made the sanitarium so appealing also made it the perfect place to hide unspeakable crimes. Mail service was sporadic, telegraph lines frequently failed, and the nearest town lay 20 miles down treacherous mountain roads that became impassable in winter. But isolation works both ways, and by the winter of 1896, Dr. Briarwood realized he wasn't just witnessing medical malpractice, he was trapped inside something far more sinister. What had Eudora Pembroke really been doing to her patients, and why were the few survivors so desperate to forget their time in her care that they'd rather die than speak about it. Dr. Briarwood's hand trembled as he pressed his ear against the basement door, listening to the rhythmic scraping sounds that echoed through the sanitarium's foundation at precisely 2 a.m. every Tuesday night. The brass doorknob felt ice cold against his palm, and somewhere below, metal clinked against stone in a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. This wasn't random midnight maintenance. This was the sound of systematic butchery, and it explained why so many patients never saw another sunrise. The discovery began 3 weeks earlier when Briarwood noticed discrepancies in the patient meal schedules. While reviewing dietary records in Eudora's office, he'd found invoices for massive quantities of raw meat, far more than needed to feed the current patient population. The numbers didn't add up unless you factored in appetites that no legitimate medical facility should accommodate. Harriet Whitakerly had been asking the wrong questions. The newest patient, a wealthy widow from Charleston suffering from what her family doctor called nervous hysteria, possessed an unfortunate combination of curiosity and courage. Unlike other patients who grew docile after their first week of treatment, Harriet maintained her sharp wit and suspicious nature. "Dr. Briarwood," she'd whispered during his evening rounds on November 2nd, "have you noticed how quiet the East Wing becomes after midnight? Yesterday I counted 17 patients going in for their treatments, but I only saw 12 come out." The East Wing housed Eudora's private treatment rooms, accessible only through a locked corridor that connected to the building's original foundation. Built into the mountainside in 1868 as a private residence, the structure's lower levels had been carved directly from living rock, creating natural chambers that remained at a constant 55 degrees year-round. Perfect conditions for preservation. Briarwood began documenting everything with the precision of a man who knew he might not survive to testify. His leather journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his quarters, filled with observations that painted an increasingly horrifying picture. November 8th, 1896. Patient Cornelius Appleton reported missing from his bed during morning rounds. EP claims he departed early for family emergency, but his belongings remain undisturbed. No record of telegraph sent to arrange transport. The deception extended beyond missing patients. Eudora had cultivated relationships with undertakers in 3 different counties, men who asked no questions about unusual burial requests or bodies that arrived in sealed caskets with explicit instructions never to be opened. Death certificates bore forged signatures from physicians who'd been dead for years. But the most chilling discovery came when Briarwood examined the facility's medical supply orders. Alongside standard medications and surgical instruments, he found recurring purchases of equipment that had no place in any legitimate hospital. Bone saws, meat grinders, industrial-grade preservation chemicals, and custom-built cold storage units designed to specifications that suggested they weren't meant for medicine. The mountain whispered secrets. Every night brought new sounds from the restricted areas, sounds that started around 1 a.m. and continued until dawn. The scraping, the wet thudding, the occasional muffled cry that could have been wind through the mountain caves, but probably wasn't. Staff members who worked the night shift developed the hollow-eyed look of people who'd seen too much and decided that survival meant blindness. On November 15th, Briarwood made a decision that would either expose the truth or ensure his own disappearance. Using a master key he'd copied from Eudora's ring, he waited until the facility settled into its deceptive midnight quiet, then made his way toward the East Wing's restricted corridor. The smell hit him first copper and decay, masked by harsh lye soap and medicinal alcohol. Then came the sound of voices, muffled but unmistakably human, drifting up from somewhere beneath the main floor. His feet found stone steps that descended into darkness, each footfall echoing in spaces that felt vast and ancient. At the bottom, candlelight flickered through an open doorway, casting dancing shadows on walls that glistened with moisture. What he saw in that underground chamber would haunt his dreams for the remaining 8 months of his life. Tables lined the space like an assembly line, each one bearing evidence of activities that defied every oath he'd taken as a physician. Tools hung from hooks with the organization of a professional kitchen, while barrels stood in neat rows along one wall, their contents marked with dates and notations in Eudora's precise handwriting. E. Holloman, November 12th. Prime cuts reserved for special guests. The realization struck him like physical blow. This wasn't just murder, it was a business. The Pembroke Mountain Sanitarium wasn't treating patients, it was processing them. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the candlelight, he could hear Eudora's voice speaking to someone in tones too casual for the horror surrounding them. But who was she talking to? And how many people knew about the real purpose of the facility's isolated location? Eudora Pembroke served her guests the finest cuts with sterling silver utensils and her grandmother's china, while the remnants of 3 missing patients lay cooling in the basement below. The dinner conversation flowed as smoothly as the imported wine, punctuated by appreciative murmurs about the exceptional tenderness of the meat. What Dr. Briarwood witnessed that night would reveal that the Pembroke Sanitarium wasn't just an isolated horror, it was the centerpiece of a sophisticated network that stretched across 3 states. Hidden behind a stack of preserving barrels, Briarwood watched through a gap in the stone wall as Eudora emerged from the processing chamber, her white apron now stained crimson, her hair still perfectly arranged. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed these tasks hundreds of times before, washing her hands in a basin before ascending the hidden staircase that led back to the main building. The voices he'd heard belonged to her dinner guests, 6 well-dressed individuals who'd arrived that evening in expensive carriages despite the treacherous mountain roads. Through careful positioning, Briarwood could observe them through the dining room's tall windows as they gathered around Eudora's mahogany table, their faces illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast warm light over what appeared to be an elegant social gathering. Clarissa Rutherford commanded attention at the head of the table, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that suggested wealth and refinement. As the owner of 3 private hospitals across Virginia and North Carolina, she possessed the credentials and connections necessary to make problematic patients disappear without raising official suspicion. Her facility specialized in what she termed difficult cases, patients whose families had grown tired of caring for them. The conspiracy ran deeper than murder. From Dr. Briarwood's journal, November 15th, 1896. Overheard CR discussing quotas for December shipments. References to Charleston, Richmond, and Baltimore suggest organized distribution network. Payment schedules mentioned this is commerce, not madness. Obadiah Fenwick sat to Clarissa's right, his round face flushed with wine and satisfaction. As a funeral director with establishments in 4 cities, he provided essential services that allowed the network to operate without detection. Families who inquired about loved ones who'd supposedly died at the sanitarium received detailed reports about peaceful final moments, complete with forged medical documents and sealed caskets that were never meant to be opened. The business model was horrifyingly simple. Wealthy families paid substantial fees to have their inconvenient relatives treated at exclusive facilities, believing they were purchasing discretion and quality care. What they actually bought was permanent silence, while their loved ones became raw materials for a gourmet trade that catered to the most depraved appetites of high society. Minerva Chatsworth represented the customer base wealthy widow who developed tastes that conventional butchers couldn't satisfy. Her Baltimore mansion hosted monthly dinner parties where select guests paid extraordinary sums for meals that promised experiences no ordinary cuisine could provide. The exclusivity wasn't just about rarity. It was about the thrill of consuming something that had once possessed thoughts, dreams, and the capacity to suffer. They never stopped smiling. Briarwood pressed himself deeper into the shadows as footsteps approached his hiding place. Prudence Halstead, Eudora's head nurse, descended the stone steps carrying a leather ledger and a ring of keys. Unlike the dinner guests above, She showed no signs of enjoyment in her work, only the grim efficiency of someone who'd learned that survival meant participation. "The Richmond order needs to be ready by Thursday," she called to someone deeper in the chambers. "Thaddeus wants the premium cuts, same as last month." Thaddeus Whitcomb emerged from the shadows, his sleeves rolled up and his hands still bloody from recent work. As the network's primary processor, he possessed skills that bridged medicine and butchery, able to break down human remains with the precision of a trained surgeon and the speed of an experienced meatpacker. His background remained mysterious, but his techniques suggested formal training that no legitimate institution would have provided. The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of the operation. Orders came from private clubs in major cities, exclusive restaurants that catered to customers willing to pay any price for the ultimate taboo experience. The Pembroke Sanitarium was just one link in a supply chain that included similar facilities across the South, each one disguised as a legitimate medical institution. But what made Eudora's operation particularly valuable was her ability to select the finest specimens. Unlike random victims, her patients came pre-screened for health, cleanliness, and the kind of privileged upbringing that supposedly improved the quality of the final product. Wealthy families inadvertently provided detailed medical histories and dietary information that allowed for optimal preparation. November 15th, 1896. Additional notes. Heard mention of the Philadelphia connection and Senator Morrison's preferences. Political figures involved at highest levels. This reaches far beyond isolated mountain facility. The realization hit Briarwood like ice water. He wasn't just witnessing isolated criminality. He was observing a thriving industry that depended on the willful blindness of respectable society. Every family who sent a troublesome relative to the sanitarium, every official who failed to investigate suspicious death certificates, every person who chose not to ask uncomfortable questions had become an enabler of systematic horror. Above him, crystal glasses clinked in toasts to successful ventures and profitable partnerships. The dinner party continued with the casual atmosphere of any business meeting, while in the basement, evidence of their crimes lay sorted and packaged for distribution to eager customers who would never know the names of what they consumed. But as Briarwood shifted position to get a better view of the processing area, his foot knocked against something metallic that clattered across the stone floor. The conversation above stopped instantly. How long did he have before they discovered his hiding place? And what would happen to someone who'd learned too much about their carefully protected business model? Footsteps descended the stone stairs with deliberate slowness, each boot heel striking rock like a countdown to discovery. Dr. Briarwood pressed himself against the cold basement wall, his breath forming visible clouds in the frigid air as shadows moved across the candlelit chamber where human remains hung from metal hooks like sides of beef. This was the moment that would determine whether he lived to expose the truth or became the next course on Eudora Pembroke's grotesque menu. The metallic clatter had been a surgical clamp, knocked from a shelf stacked with instruments that belonged in an operating theater, not a mountain basement. Prudence Halstead appeared first, her starched white uniform, a stark contrast to the blood-stained apron she wore over it. Behind her came Thaddeus Whitcomb, wiping his hands on a rag that left red streaks across his fingers. "Probably just rats," Prudence muttered, but her voice carried the tension of someone who knew that discovery meant death for everyone involved. The network's success depended on absolute secrecy, maintained through methods that made prison seem merciful by comparison. Briarwood held his breath as they moved through the chamber, checking corners and examining the processing tables for signs of disturbance. Above them, the dinner party had resumed, but the conversation now carried an edge of nervous energy. Clarissa Rutherford's voice drifted down through the ceiling, discussing shipping schedules with the casual tone of someone arranging flower deliveries rather than human cargo. The business never stopped growing. By 1896, The network had expanded to include facilities in 7 states, each one masquerading as a legitimate medical institution, while serving the appetites of customers who paid premium prices for experiences that pushed beyond every moral boundary. Private clubs in New York and Philadelphia competed for access to the finest selections, while railroad connections allowed for rapid distribution that kept the product fresh during transport. From recovered correspondence, dated November 10th, 1896, the Baltimore shipment exceeded expectations. Senator Morrison's guests were particularly impressed with the tenderness of the November selections. Please reserve similar quality for the Christmas gathering. M. Chadsworth. Briarwood waited until their footsteps receded before attempting his escape. The basement connected to a series of natural caves that had been used by the mountain's previous residents for cold storage, creating a maze of passages that extended deep into the rocky foundation. If he could reach the cave system, he might find an alternate exit that would allow him to escape without alerting the dinner guests. The darkness beyond the candlelit chamber felt absolute, broken only by occasional drafts of mountain air that suggested openings to the outside world. His medical bag contained a small hand mirror that he used to reflect what little light penetrated the gloom, revealing tunnels carved from living rock by generations of mountain families who'd understood that survival sometimes required places to hide. Behind him, voices grew more agitated. Someone had noticed that items in the processing chamber had been disturbed, and Eudora's calm authority now carried undertones of deadly concern. The dinner party was breaking up, with guests departing through carefully planned routes that would prevent them from being seen together by any potential witnesses. The cave system emerged into a natural chimney that rose through the mountain's core, its walls slick with condensation and carved with handholds that suggested regular use. Briarwood climbed toward a circle of starlight that marked an opening somewhere near the ridgeline, his muscles burning from the effort, while his mind raced with plans for exposing what he'd discovered. But escape was only the beginning of his problems. The network's reach extended far beyond the isolated sanitarium, involving individuals with the power to destroy anyone who threatened their operations. Clarissa Rutherford's hospitals provided legitimate cover for patient transfers, while Obadiah Fenwick's funeral establishments eliminated evidence through cremations that no one would question. The conspiracy included judges, police officials, and railroad executives who ensured that investigations never proceeded far enough to uncover uncomfortable truths. Briarwood emerged from the cave opening onto a narrow ledge that overlooked the valley below, where lights from distant settlements twinkled like fallen stars. The November air bit through his clothing, but the cold felt cleansing after the charnel house atmosphere of the basement chambers. His pocket watch showed 3:27 a.m., giving him several hours before his absence would be noticed during morning rounds. The descent down Devil's Backbone Ridge tested every ounce of his remaining strength. The trail, such as it was, consisted of loose rock and exposed tree roots that became treacherous in the pre-dawn darkness. One misstep would send him tumbling hundreds of feet into the rocky gorge below, but the alternative was certain death at the hands of people who'd turned murder into a profitable industry. November 16th, 1896, written by lamplight in abandoned cabin. Must reach authorities, but who can be trusted? Network includes prominent citizens whose testimonies would carry more weight than accusations from unknown physician, need evidence that cannot be disputed. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, Briarwood reached the abandoned mining camp that marked the halfway point to the nearest town. The settlement had been deserted for 3 years, but the remaining structures provided shelter while he planned his next moves. The journal hidden in his medical bag contained detailed observations, but he knew that written testimony alone wouldn't be enough to convince authorities to investigate such respected citizens. He needed physical evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. The basement chambers contained enough material to convict everyone involved, but retrieving it would require returning to a place where his presence was now known and his survival unlikely. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the valley, carried on the crisp morning air with the clarity that only mountain acoustics could provide. Multiple riders moving fast along the main trail, their urgency suggesting a search party rather than casual travelers. How had they tracked him so quickly? And what did Eudora Pembroke do to people who learned too much about her family's carefully guarded business? Dr. Briarwood pressed himself flat against the rotting floorboards of the abandoned mining shack as hoofbeats thundered past, close enough that he could smell the lathered sweat of horses driven hard through mountain terrain. Through gaps in the weathered planks, he glimpsed at least 6 riders, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats, their movements coordinated with military precision. These weren't local searchers looking for a missing physician. They were professionals dispatched to eliminate a threat to an operation worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The riders spread out in a pattern that suggested extensive knowledge of the mountain's geography, covering escape routes with the efficiency of men who'd performed similar hunts before. Eudora Pembroke's network possessed resources that extended far beyond a single sanitarium, including enforcers who specialized in making problems disappear without leaving traces that might lead back to their employers. Elias Fairweather dismounted near the mining camp's main entrance, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground as he examined tracks that Briarwood had tried to conceal. As a former cavalry scout turned private investigator, he possessed skills that made him invaluable to clients who needed discreet solutions to sensitive problems. His reputation for thoroughness had earned him contracts with some of the South's most prominent families. The business of silence paid well. From his hiding place, Briarwood watched as Fairweather studied broken twigs and disturbed leaves with the focus of someone reading a detailed map. The tracker's movements carried the confidence of a man who'd never failed to locate his quarry, whether they were runaway slaves, embezzling bank officials, or physicians who'd learned too much about their patients' fates. From Elias Fairweather's private records, discovered 1,923. Standard rates apply for location and retrieval. Disposal services available at additional cost. No questions asked, no evidence remaining. Satisfaction guaranteed or full refund. The other riders had positioned themselves at strategic points around the abandoned settlement, creating a perimeter that would be impossible to breach without detection. Their coordination suggested regular collaboration, probably spanning multiple states, where similar cleanup operations had been necessary to protect the network's expanding business interests. But Briarwood possessed one advantage his pursuers couldn't have anticipated. During his medical training in Philadelphia, he'd spent summers working in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, learning to navigate underground passages that connected seemingly separate locations. The abandoned mining camp sat atop a network of tunnels that had been carved to follow veins of low-grade ore, creating hidden pathways that extended for miles beneath the mountain's surface. The entrance lay concealed beneath a collapsed section of the main shaft, marked only by a current of cold air that rose from openings too narrow for horses or large groups of men. Briarwood had discovered it during his descent from Devil's Backbone, recognizing the telltale signs of extensive excavation that mountain families had used for generations to move unseen through territory controlled by hostile forces. The tunnels offered more than escape. They provided access to something that could destroy the entire network. While examining the mining camp's abandoned equipment, Briarwood had discovered a leather satchel wedged behind a support beam, apparently hidden by someone who'd never returned to retrieve it. The contents included surveyor's maps, correspondence, and most importantly, a detailed ledger that documented financial transactions spanning the past 5 years. November 12th, 1,896. Ledger entry: C. Rutherford, 12 units, premium grade, 2,400. M. Chadsworth, 8 units, specialty preparation, 1,900. T. Whitcomb processing fees, $340. The numbers revealed an operation generating profits that rivaled legitimate businesses, with individual transactions worth more than most families earned in a year. The ledger's meticulous record-keeping suggested an organization confident in its security, never imagining that their activities would be exposed by a chance discovery in an abandoned mining camp. The approaching search grew more systematic as Fairweather's team closed their perimeter. Voices carried through the thin mountain air, coordinating movements with the precision of a military operation. They weren't just looking for Briarwood. They were securing an area that contained evidence capable of destroying lives and fortunes across multiple states. Overheard conversation, November 16th, 1896. Mrs. Pembroke wants this finished before dawn. Can't have word reaching Charleston before the senator's dinner party. Too much money involved to risk exposure now. Briarwood gathered the most damning documents from the hidden satchel, stuffing them inside his medical bag alongside his own observations. The combination of financial records and first-hand testimony would provide irrefutable evidence of systematic murder disguised as medical treatment, but only if he survived long enough to present it to authorities who weren't already corrupted by the network's influence. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the mining camp as searchers began dismantling structures that might conceal hiding places. Their methodical approach left no possibility of remaining concealed until they departed, forcing Briarwood toward the underground passages that represented his only chance of reaching civilization alive. They had found something. The entrance to the tunnel system lay 20 yards from his current position, across open ground that would leave him exposed for several crucial seconds. Above him, footsteps moved across the shack's roof, while voices discussed the systematic destruction of anything that might harbor evidence or witnesses. But as Briarwood prepared to make his desperate dash toward the tunnels, he heard something that froze his blood. Fairweather was speaking to someone through a portable telegraph device, reporting their progress to handlers who were coordinating similar operations across multiple locations. How many other people had discovered the truth about the Pembroke network, and what was happening to them at this very moment? The telegraph key clicked in rapid bursts as Fairweather transmitted coordinates to search teams positioned across 3 counties, each pulse of electrical current, sealing the fate of anyone who'd stumbled onto evidence of the network's operations. Dr. Briarwood counted the Morse code taps from his hiding place, recognizing the military precision of a coordinated manhunt that stretched far beyond the isolated mountain sanitarium. This wasn't just about silencing one witness, it was about protecting a criminal enterprise that had infected the highest levels of American society. The moment came when boots thundered across the shack's roof, directly above his position, forcing Briarwood into a desperate sprint toward the concealed tunnel entrance. 20 yards of open ground stretched before him like a killing field, every step potentially his last, as voices shouted behind him and the crack of rifle fire split the morning air. He dove through the narrow opening just as bullets splintered the wooden support beams, sending splinters of ancient timber cascading into the darkness below. The tunnel system opened into a labyrinth that had been carved over decades by miners, following veins of silver and coal, creating passages that connected distant points across the mountain range. But these tunnels harbored secrets that predated the mining operations by generations. The walls bore markings that Briarwood initially mistook for surveyors' notations, until closer examination revealed they were actually shipping manifests carved into the stone itself. Names, dates, and destinations that documented a trade network far older and more extensive than anything he'd imagined. The Pembroke family hadn't created this horror, they'd simply modernized and expanded a business that had operated in these mountains since before the Civil War. Wall carving, estimated 1,847, 23 units to Richmond via C.O. rail. Premium stock, well-fed specimens. Payment received in Confederate scrip, J. Pembroke Sr. The tunnel system had served as more than transportation. It was a distribution network that connected suppliers across the Appalachian region with customers in major cities. Underground railways that had once carried escaped slaves to freedom now transported human cargo in the opposite direction, delivering carefully selected victims to processing facilities that operated under the guise of legitimate businesses. The scope was breathtaking in its evil efficiency. As Briarwood navigated the branching passages, following air currents that indicated surface openings, he discovered evidence of systematic operations that spanned generations. Storage chambers contained preserved records dating back to the 1840s, documenting transactions with restaurants, private clubs, and wealthy individuals who developed appetites that conventional society couldn't satisfy. The customer base included names that would have shocked the nation: senators, railroad barons, industrial magnates, and religious leaders who publicly condemned moral decay while privately indulging in the ultimate transgression. Their payments funded an infrastructure that rivaled any legitimate business enterprise, complete with specialized equipment, trained personnel, and distribution networks that reached into every major American city. From recovered correspondence, dated 1892. The Senator's annual gathering requires 12 premium selections, ages 16-25. Clean bills of health, essential, payment as usual through Baltimore Bank, discretion guaranteed. E. Pembroke. They had perfected their craft. The processing facilities weren't limited to the Pembroke Sanitarium. Briarwood's journey through the tunnels revealed connections to at least 6 other locations, each one disguised as a respectable institution while serving the network's true purpose. Orphanages provided young specimens, private hospitals eliminated inconvenient patients, and funeral homes ensured that evidence never surfaced to threaten the operation's security. The tunnel he followed emerged near a railway siding where a freight car sat on a seldom-used branch line. Steam rose from vents in the car's sides, and the smell of preservation chemicals mixed with something more organic suggested cargo that required specialized handling during transport. A manifest nailed to the sliding door listed the contents as medical specimens for research purposes, but Briarwood knew the real destination was probably one of the exclusive restaurants that catered to customers willing to pay any price for forbidden experiences. Railroad schedules coordinated with remarkable precision, ensuring that shipments reached their destinations while products remained fresh. The network had infiltrated transportation systems across multiple states, corrupting officials and establishing legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their actual operations. Behind him, voices echoed through the tunnel system as Fairweather's team located the entrance and began pursuit. Their familiarity with the underground passages suggested they'd used these routes before, probably to transport both victims and evidence to locations where disposal could be accomplished without detection. The ledger in Briarwood's medical bag contained more than financial records. It included shipping schedules, customer preferences, and most damning of all, a roster of government officials who received regular payments to ensure that investigations never proceeded far enough to uncover uncomfortable truths. The corruption reached into police departments, courts, and federal agencies that should have been protecting citizens from exactly this kind of systematic predation. November 16th, 1896. Final journal entry. Network extends beyond imagination. Customer list includes current members of Congress, federal judges, railroad executives. This goes to the very top of American society. Evidence must reach someone beyond their influence. As Briarwood approached another surface opening, marked by growing daylight and the sound of running water, he realized that escape was only the first challenge. The network possessed resources and connections that could destroy anyone who threatened their operations, regardless of evidence or moral authority. The real question wasn't whether he could reach civilization alive, but whether any authority existed with enough power and integrity to challenge an organization that had corrupted the very institutions meant to enforce justice. But as he emerged from the tunnel system, onto the banks of a mountain stream, the sound of approaching train whistles echoed across the valley, and Briarwood understood that the network's next shipment was about to depart with cargo that might include people he'd failed to save. The locomotive's whistle screamed across the valley as Dr. Briarwood stumbled from the tree line, his clothes torn and bloodied from the desperate flight through mountain tunnels that reeked of death and decades-old secrets. Steam billowed from the engine's stack, while railroad workers loaded the final cargo car with containers that bore innocuous medical labels, but moved with the weight of human remains. This was his last chance to stop a shipment that would feed the appetites of powerful men who believed their wealth placed them beyond the reach of justice or moral consequence. The mountain stream provided cover as Briarwood approached the railway siding, its rushing water masking his footsteps, while he studied the operation that unfolded with clockwork precision. Workers moved between the freight cars with practiced efficiency, checking manifests and securing cargo that would reach customers across the eastern seaboard within 48 hours. Esther Holloman supervised the loading from beside the locomotive, her severe black dress and starched collar lending an air of medical authority to what was actually the final stage of systematic murder. As Eudora Pembroke's business partner and the network's logistics coordinator, she possessed connections that extended into railroad management, ensuring that these special shipments traveled on schedules that avoided inspection by curious officials. The operation's scope defied imagination. Through careful positioning near the loading platform, Briarwood could observe manifest sheets that documented shipments to restaurants in Boston, private clubs in New York, and exclusive gatherings in Washington, where senators and cabinet members indulged appetites that would have destroyed their careers if exposed to public scrutiny. Manifest excerpt, November 16th, 1896. Car 47B, 12 premium units for Delmonico's private dining room. Car 48A, 8 specialty preparations for Senator Morrison's Arlington estate. Car 49C, mixed selections for Baltimore Gentlemen's Club winter banquet. The human cost was documented with the same clinical precision used for livestock shipments. Ages, physical descriptions, and preparation methods were noted alongside estimated arrival times and customer preferences. Each entry represented someone's child, parent, or sibling, reduced to meat that would grace tables where the nation's elite celebrated their power over life and death. They never showed remorse. The loading continued as dawn light revealed the full extent of the railway operation. Multiple freight cars waited on sidings that connected to major rail lines, their destinations including every significant city between Atlanta and Philadelphia. The network had evolved far beyond the isolated mountain sanitarium, becoming a distribution system that supplied an underground market worth millions in contemporary currency. But Briarwood's presence hadn't gone unnoticed. Fairweather and his tracking team emerged from the tunnel entrance he'd used, their horses snorting steam in the cold air as they surveyed the railway siding with professional assessment. The hunt was entering its final phase, with nowhere left to run, and evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy still clutched in his medical bag. The confrontation came without warning. Esther Holloman stepped around the locomotive's cowcatcher, her pale eyes fixed on Briarwood with the cold calculation of someone who'd eliminated obstacles before. Behind her, railroad workers revealed themselves as armed guards, their tools replaced by weapons that suggested experience with more than freight handling. "Dr. Briarwood," she called across the loading platform, her voice carrying clearly over the engine's hissing steam. "You've caused considerable inconvenience with your midnight wanderings. Mrs. Pembroke is quite concerned about your well-being." The lie carried no conviction, only the ritual politeness that preceded execution. Briarwood understood that his survival depended on the evidence he'd gathered, not its existence, but its potential to destroy people whose power extended far beyond a mountain railway siding. "I have documentation," he shouted back, holding up the leather ledger that contained names and transactions capable of toppling governments. Financial records, shipping manifests, customer lists that include sitting senators and federal judges. This reaches into the highest levels of American society. The deadly theater began. Esther's smile never wavered as she signaled to the armed guards, who began moving to flank Briarwood's position near the stream. But her confidence suggested knowledge that he lacked some factor that made his threats meaningless, despite the explosive nature of his evidence. "Documentation can be discredited," she replied, stepping closer with the casual movement of someone who controlled every aspect of the situation, especially when it comes from a physician suffering from nervous exhaustion and delusions of persecution. Such tragic cases require immediate treatment at specialized facilities. The realization struck like a physical blow. The network didn't just eliminate threats, it discredited them through institutional authority that rendered their testimony worthless. How many other witnesses had been dismissed as mentally unstable, their evidence buried beneath medical diagnoses that justified permanent confinement or convenient deaths? Behind him, hoofbeats approached as Fairweather's team closed their perimeter. The railway workers had transformed into professional killers, their movements coordinated with military precision. Even if Briarwood escaped immediate capture, the network possessed resources to pursue him indefinitely while destroying his reputation and credibility. But as the locomotive's engineer prepared to depart with cargo that would feed the appetites of America's most powerful citizens, a new sound echoed across the valley, the thunder of approaching horses, carrying riders whose presence would change everything about this deadly confrontation. Who else had discovered the truth about the Pembroke network, and were they coming as allies or additional threats to eliminate the last witness to systematic horror? Federal Marshal Phoebe Winthrop raised her rifle as her cavalry unit crested the ridge overlooking the railway siding, their badges glinting in the morning sunlight, while the Pembroke network's final shipment sat steaming on tracks that would never carry human cargo again. The thunder of hooves that had echoed across the valley belonged to a force that even Eudora Pembroke's extensive corruption couldn't control. A federal investigation that had been building in secret for over 2 years. This was the moment when systematic evil would finally face justice, but the cost of that reckoning would prove higher than anyone anticipated. Marshal Winthrop had been tracking the network since 1894, when her own sister had disappeared after seeking treatment at a private sanitarium in Tennessee. Unlike local authorities who could be bought or intimidated, federal marshals answered directly to Washington officials who remained outside the conspiracy's influence. Her investigation had uncovered a trail of evidence that stretched across 7 states, implicating hundreds of individuals in what would become known as the largest criminal enterprise in American history. The confrontation unfolded with devastating swiftness. Esther Holloman's confident smile vanished as federal agents surrounded the railway siding, their weapons trained on workers who'd been loading human remains into freight cars bound for the nation's most exclusive dining establishments. The locomotive engineer abandoned his post, fleeing into the woods while steam continued to billow from the abandoned engine. Dr. Briarwood staggered toward the federal forces, his medical bag clutched against his chest like a lifeline. The ledger and documents he'd recovered contained evidence that would expose the full scope of the network's operations, but Marshal Winthrop's grim expression suggested she already possessed information that made his discoveries redundant. "We've been watching this operation for months," she called to him across the loading platform. "Your midnight escape simply accelerated our timeline. We have warrants for everyone involved, from the processing facilities to the customers in Washington." The network's response revealed the true extent of their power. Instead of surrender, Esther Holloman produced a telegraph device and began transmitting coded messages that activated contingency plans developed over decades of operation. Within minutes, explosions echoed from multiple points across the mountain range as evidence was systematically destroyed. The Pembroke Sanitarium's basement chambers erupted in flames that could be seen from miles away, while similar fires consumed facilities in 3 other states. From Marshall Winthrop's official report, dated November 20th, 1896, coordinated destruction of evidence suggests organization with resources and planning capabilities that rival military operations. Estimated loss of physical evidence exceeds 90%. The arrests began immediately, but the network's tentacles reached deeper than federal authorities had imagined. Within hours of the railway siding raid, key witnesses began disappearing from custody through legal maneuvers orchestrated by lawyers whose clients included some of the most powerful figures in American politics. Judges issued releases based on technicalities, while evidence mysteriously vanished from secure facilities. They had planned for this moment. Fairweather and his tracking team melted into the forest like smoke, their horses carrying them toward escape routes that had been established long before federal authorities learned of the network's existence. The conspiracy included railroad executives who could provide transportation, corrupt officials who could issue false documents, and international connections that offered sanctuary beyond American jurisdiction. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr. Briarwood opened his recovered ledger in the presence of federal marshals. The customer list included names that reached into the highest levels of government, implicating senators, cabinet members, and federal judges in systematic cannibalism that had operated under the protection of institutional authority. The cover-up began before the arrests were complete. Within 72 hours, orders came from Washington directing federal marshals to limit their investigation to operational personnel, while avoiding any actions that might compromise national security or undermine public confidence in democratic institutions. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. Some truths were too dangerous for public consumption. Marshall Winthrop found herself reassigned to frontier territories where her expertise would be wasted on minor disputes between settlers and cattle rustlers. Dr. Forma. Briarwood received an offer of employment at a government hospital in Alaska, with the understanding that his continued health depended on accepting the position and maintaining absolute silence about his mountain experiences. From Dr. Briarwood's final journal entry, December 1st, 1896. Justice has been subordinated to stability. The guilty remain free, while witnesses are exiled to ensure their silence. Some evils are too large for society to acknowledge without destroying itself. The official record would show that the Pembroke Mountain Sanitarium closed due to financial difficulties, with no mention of the systematic murders that had occurred within its walls. Obituaries praised Eudora Pembroke as a pioneering physician who died tragically in an accidental fire, while her network's customers continued their activities at new facilities established in more remote locations. Only fragments of truth survived the coordinated suppression. Local newspapers in mountain communities published brief stories about unexplained fires and missing persons, but larger publications avoided coverage that might implicate powerful advertisers and political allies. The story disappeared into the margins of history, preserved only in whispered rumors and private documents that surfaced decades later. The final train departed, the mountain siding empty, its cargo destroyed in the federal raid. But the network's operations simply relocated to territories where oversight was minimal and corruption more easily maintained. Marshall Winthrop's investigation had exposed one facility, while dozens of others continued operating under new management and enhanced security. Dr. Briarwood boarded a ship bound for Alaska in December of 1896, carrying secrets that would follow him to an unmarked grave in the frozen wilderness. His final letter, discovered in 1932 during renovation of a Juneau boarding house, contained a single sentence that summarized the futility of fighting systematic evil. The mountain claimed 39 lives, but the network claimed justice itself. The taste of forbidden flesh had proven more addictive than anyone imagined, creating customers whose appetites could never be satisfied by conventional means. Even today, Hikers in the Virginia mountains report finding strange cooking implements and bone fragments near abandoned railway sidings, while expensive restaurants in major cities serve specialty dishes whose origins remain carefully unexamined. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.